The first laugh came before Silas Rourke reached the courthouse steps. Silas stopped beside the hitch rail, a bundle of winter pelts over one shoulder. Granite Crossing lay beneath a pale October sky, its boardwalks warped, and its mud hardened by frost. Beyond Main Street, the hidden river in Black Glass Gorge sounded like distant thunder. A crowd had gathered beneath the courthouse clock. At its center stood a woman in a dark blue dress, one hand resting on a white hickory cane. She was not stooped, though the men around her spoke as if she were already broken. Her face was turned toward the courthouse doors. A faded scar crossed her left temple and disappeared into the hair above her ear. Her eyes were open, gray and unfocused. Darius Vale stood 3 steps above her, warm in a black wool coat with a silver watch chain bright across his vest. "I am not asking the court to punish Mrs. Hart," he said, loud enough for the crowd. "I am asking it to protect her." A few people nodded. Vale owned the freight wagons, the ferry landing, and most of the notes signed by merchants between Granite Crossing and the North Pass. He had learned long ago that concern sounded cleaner than greed. Evelyn Hart lifted her chin. "You filed to have me declared incompetent." "I filed to place the property under responsible stewardship. Yours." A murmur moved through the crowd. Vale gave her the patient smile a man used on a child. "The bond on your river claim is overdue. The land brings no income. Your husband is dead, and you cannot survey, farm, or defend the property alone. I surveyed it before I lost my sight. You assisted your husband. I corrected him." That drew another laugh, sharper than the first. Silas watched her fingers tighten around the cane. Only once, then the hand relaxed. Deputy Cole Mercer stood near the courthouse door, looking uncomfortable beneath his brass star. Beside him, Reverend Pike held a Bible against his chest, as though expecting to be called as a witness. Val unfolded a paper. "At noon," he said, "the circuit clerk will hear my petition. If no qualified relative or co-owner appears on Mrs. Hart's behalf, temporary stewardship passes to my company until the matter is settled." "Your company takes the land," Evelyn said. "My company keeps you from starving on it." That was when Silas saw where Vale was looking, not at the woman, past her, toward the eastern rim of Black Glass Gorge, where a narrow shelf of granite rose above the ferry road. Silas knew that shelf. 6 years earlier, his younger brother Daniel had tried to cross below it during spring runoff. They found the horse 2 miles downstream. They never found Daniel. Silas stepped away from the hitch rail. A boy near the edge of the crowd noticed him first and went quiet. Then an older man turned. The silence spread ahead of Silas as he crossed the street, his boots striking frozen ruts. He was taller than most men in the valley, broad from years of carrying traps and meat over mountain ground. A long knife rode at his hip. His rifle remained on the pack horse. Vale's smile thinned. "Rourke," he said, "court business." Silas looked at Evelyn. "Do you want his help?" The question seemed to unsettle her more than Vale's threats. She turned toward his voice with careful precision. "No. Do you want mine?" The courthouse steps went still. Vale descended 1 step. "This is not a fur trade, Rourke. You cannot throw down a pelt and buy your way into a legal proceeding. I didn't ask you." A few men shifted back. Silas kept his attention on Evelyn. She measured the space between them by his breathing and the scrape of leather when he moved. Her composed face belonged to someone accustomed to strangers mistaking quiet for surrender. "What kind of help are you offering?" she asked. "The kind you name." Vale laughed softly. "He cannot even read the petition." Silas looked at him then. I can read a man who wants land he calls worthless." The smile left Vale's face. Evelyn's cane tapped once against the stone. "Mr. Rourke," she said, "are you in debt to Darius Vale?" "No." "Do you own property in this county?" "A cabin above Cold Elk Ridge." "Trapper's deed." "Any living wife?" "No." "Any reason a clerk could deny you standing as a co-owner?" Silas glanced toward the courthouse. "Not unless smelling like wood smoke is a crime now." Someone snorted. Evelyn did not smile. "There is one way to stop the temporary stewardship today," she said. "A deed transfer would take weeks. A business charter requires witnesses Vale controls. Marriage would place the claim under joint household title before noon." The laughter that followed was immediate. It burst from the boardwalk and courthouse steps, from teamsters in Vale's employ and women who had come carrying market baskets. A man near Amos Klein's general store shouted, "Take care, Rourke. She'll have you fetching her boots before sundown." Another called, "At least she won't see what she married." Reverend Pike lowered his eyes, though not in shame. Silas looked at Evelyn. Color had risen along her cheekbones, but she had not moved. "You're asking me?" he said. "I am offering terms." "Terms." "You receive half interest in the claim for 1 year. You provide legal standing and physical security. We keep separate rooms and separate accounts. At the end of the year, if the bond is paid and the property is secure, you may sign your share back or sell it to me at the original value." Vale came down another step. "Mrs. Hart, this is desperation dressed as a contract." She turned her face toward him. "And your petition is theft dressed as mercy." The crowd quieted. Silas felt the compass beneath his shirt press cold against his skin. Daniel's compass. The needle inside had not pointed true since the river took him, but Silas carried it anyway. "What is on that land?" he asked. Evelyn paused. "Work," she said. Vale's jaw tightened almost invisibly. Silas saw it. He stepped beside her. "All right." Her breath caught. "You understand I did not ask to be rescued. I heard you ask for a husband on paper, and nothing more. That can be written down too." Deputy Mercer cleared his throat. "The clerk can draw an agreement." Vale's gaze moved from Silas to Evelyn, calculating the distance to noon, the weight of the witnesses, the danger of objecting too loudly. "You know nothing about her claim," he said. Silas faced him. "Then you should have let it go." The clerk opened the courthouse doors. They signed in a room that smelled of coal dust, old paper, and damp wool. The agreement took 40 minutes. Evelyn insisted each clause be read aloud, corrected management authority to shared title, and required both signatures for any sale or mortgage. Silas said little. He watched Vale wait in the corridor, a dark shape moving past the frosted glass. When the clerk asked Silas to mark the marriage register, he printed his name slowly. The letters were rough but legible. Evelyn signed without hesitation. Her script was even. Silas looked at it. "You practice," he said, "every morning." The clerk sanded the ink. "Reverend Pike can perform the vows outside. We need 2 witnesses." "I'll witness." The voice came from the back of the room. Gideon Shaw, the blacksmith, stood near the stove, with soot dark in the creases of his hands. He had come to file a lien on an unpaid wagon repair. His eyes moved briefly to Vale beyond the glass. Amos Klein appeared in the doorway. "I suppose I can be the second." Silas knew why. Klein did not want to miss whatever happened next. The wedding took place on the courthouse steps. By the time Evelyn came outside, the crowd had doubled. Silas stood on her right. She wore no veil, no flowers, and no expression the crowd could use against her. Reverend Pike spoke as though performing a duty he expected heaven to question. They answered when required. Then Pike asked for the ring. Silas had none. The crowd began to stir. Gideon reached into the pocket of his leather apron and tossed Silas a narrow iron washer, newly forged and still dark from oil. "File the edges later," he said. Silas slid it onto Evelyn's finger. The laughter came again. It rose on both sides of the steps as Silas took her hand to guide her down. Evelyn's fingers were cold but steady inside his. A woman whispered loudly, "A blind widow and a mountain brute. Winter will finish what sense forgot." Silas felt Evelyn stop. He expected her to pull away. Instead, she turned her head toward the crowd. "You should save your breath," she said. Laughter has never held weight. The amusement faltered. Silas glanced down at her. "What does?" She tightened her grip on his hand. A sound foundation. Vale was standing beside the courthouse column. For the first time that morning, he looked afraid. They left town in Silas's wagon beneath a sky the color of hammered lead. Evelyn sat beside him with her cane laid across her knees. Her belongings fit in one cedar trunk, one carpet bag, and a wooden chest secured beneath a tarp in the wagon bed. Silas's pack horse followed behind, carrying traps, blankets, and the winter pelts Vale's interruption had kept him from trading. The road descended from Granite Crossing through stands of lodgepole pine. After half a mile, the roar of Black Glass Gorge grew louder. It was a harsh, ceaseless sound, water striking stone far below. "You knew the location of my land," Evelyn said. Silas kept his eyes on the road. "I knew the gorge. Most men avoid that road in October. Most men have sense." "Do you?" "Not today." Her mouth moved, almost a smile. They traveled another quarter-mile before she spoke again. "Vale expects the ferry route to be purchased by the Territorial Freight Company next spring. My eastern shelf is the only place where a second landing could be cut without blasting half the cliff. You think he wants another ferry?" "No." Silas looked at her. She faced forward, listening to the wheels and the river. "He wants to make sure no one builds anything better." The Hart claim sat above the gorge where the pine forest broke against a long spine of granite. The cabin had once been painted yellow. Wind and mountain winters had stripped it to gray boards. A stone shed leaned near the tree line, and rusted survey stakes marched toward the cliff. Silas pulled the wagon to a stop. Beyond the cabin, the land fell away. Black Glass River boiled 200 feet below, narrow and black between sheer walls. On the opposite side, a second granite shelf rose at nearly the same height. Freight roads approached both rims, then turned south toward Vale's Ferry, adding almost 3 days to any northern journey. Silas understood the value at once. He also understood the danger. "No crossing here," he said. Evelyn climbed down before he could offer his arm. She found the ground with her cane, then reached back for the wagon rail. "Not yet." Silas unloaded the cedar trunk and carpet bag. When he reached for the tarp-covered wooden chest, Evelyn said, "That one goes to the stone shed." It was heavier than it looked. "What's in it?" "My reason for getting married." Inside the stone shed, workbenches lined the walls. Shelves held rope, wooden pegs, brass fasteners, and stacks of thin boards. Evelyn moved differently there. She no longer tested each step with caution. Her cane found 3 familiar points: the doorframe, a floor groove, the edge of the central table, and then she crossed the room without hesitation. "Set the chest here," she said. Silas placed it on the table. She drew a key from beneath her collar and opened the lock. Inside lay dozens of shaped wooden pieces wrapped in cloth. Evelyn removed them one by one, arranging them by touch. Beams, triangles, cross braces, small towers with channels cut through their tops. Coiled strings knotted at measured intervals. Silas watched a structure rise beneath her hands. Not a child's model. A bridge. 2 trussed spans reached from the granite shelves toward a suspended center section. The anchoring towers leaned back against carved blocks that represented the cliffs. Every joint had been fitted. Every line carried a tiny tag marked with raised dots. Evelyn placed the final cross brace and rested both hands on the table. "My husband wanted a larger ferry," she said. "He believed a stronger cable would solve the river." Silas looked through the miniature trusses toward the real gorge beyond the open door. "And you didn't. A river in flood does not care how strong the ferry rope is. So I measured the shelves. Before the quarry blast took my sight, I surveyed both rims. Afterward, I rebuilt the measurements from my field notes, Nathan's ledgers, and the distances I remembered walking." Silas touched one of the small towers. It did not shift. "You designed this blind?" "I finished it blind." "That is not the same answer." "No." She turned toward him. "It is the honest one." He examined the model again. He had crossed army trestles and mining bridges. This design was larger than anything 2 people could build before winter. It was also possible. "How long?" he asked. "If the first snow comes late, we can set the anchor housings before the ground freezes. We cut timber through winter. We raise the trusses in March. The center span goes out before the spring rise." "We?" "You agreed to labor." "I agreed to keep Vale off the deed." Evelyn found a bundle of rolled paper and placed it before him. "Then check my figures. Walk the eastern shelf. Count the paces between the red stakes. Measure the cliff face from the iron pin Nathan drove into the granite. If I am wrong, you can sleep in the cabin until the year ends and call this a foolish widow's dream." "And if you're right?" Her scarred eyes held nothing, yet Silas had the strange impression she was looking farther than anyone in Granite Crossing. "Then, we build the road Vale cannot own." Outside, the river struck the canyon walls with a force that shook the stone beneath their boots. Silas looked at the model, then at the distant rim. He had come down from the mountains for salt, powder, and coffee. By noon, he had acquired a wife. By sundown, she had handed him a bridge. He reached for the measuring rope. "Show me the first stake." At first light, Silas carried the measuring rope toward the eastern shelf, while Evelyn followed the route in her memory. Frost silvered the bunch grass and made the granite slick beneath his boots. Evelyn kept one hand on the rope tied loosely around his waist, not because she needed to be led, she had told him, but because the open ground near the gorge gave her too few echoes to judge distance safely. "Red stake," she said, after 37 paces. Silas looked down. A weather-bleached marker leaned between 2 stones, its last strip of red cloth almost colorless. "Here, measure from the iron pin, not the stake." Nathan moved the stake after the thaw. Silas found the pin driven into a seam of granite. He hooked the rope over it, walked north, and counted the knots aloud. Evelyn followed, her cane testing the ground ahead of her. At the 14th knot, she stopped him. "There should be a split boulder 3 feet to your left." He looked. The boulder was there. By mid-morning, Silas had checked every dimension she gave him. The distance between anchor points matched within inches. The eastern shelf rose higher than the western by less than 2 feet, just as the model showed. Even the slight inward pitch of the canyon walls had been marked in her raised drawings. He climbed down a narrow ledge to inspect the granite face. When he returned, his palms were scraped, and his doubt had become a different kind of trouble. "It can be done," he said. Evelyn stood beside the iron pin, her face turned toward the wind. "That is not the same as saying we can do it." "No. How much timber?" "More than you own." "I own trees. Standing trees are not bridge beams." "How much iron?" "More than Granite Crossing keeps in one place." "How many men?" Silas looked across the gorge. "6 who know what they're doing. 10 if they don't. We have 2. 1.5. Her cane struck his boot. He almost laughed. They returned to the stone shed and worked until the daylight failed. Evelyn sat at the central table with her fingers moving across the model while Silas described the cliff face in exact terms. Cracks, shelves, loose stone, the angle of every approach. Whenever he used a word such as wide or steep, she stopped him. "How wide?" 6 feet. "At the narrowest point or the average?" "Average." "Then say average." By the time they finished, Silas had learned that Evelyn did not need kindness from his descriptions. She needed accuracy. She established their working rules over a supper of beans and hard bread. "When you move a tool, tell me. All right? When you leave an open trench, rope it. All right? When you see something I cannot account for, describe it before you change the plan." Silas tore bread with his hands. "And when I'm 50 feet above the gorge, you follow the measurements. What if the measurements are wrong?" She was quiet for a moment. "Then you tell me before gravity does." He studied her across the table. Firelight moved over the scar at her temple. She had asked for a practical arrangement, yet there was nothing cold in the way she took responsibility for the danger. "My rule," he said, "if I call danger, you stop moving. Even when you are mistaken. Especially then. We can argue after." She considered it and nodded. "One more," he said. "What?" "Eat before the food freezes." That time she did smile, though only for an instant. The first week went into clearing the anchor sites. Silas cut away brush, rolled loose stone from the work area, and marked the planned trenches with stakes. Evelyn made measuring cords beside the cabin, tying a different knot for every foot, 5 feet and 10. She rubbed beeswax into the fibers so ice would not shorten them, and fixed small brass tags to the ends for identification by touch. They learned each other by the interruptions. Silas learned that 3 taps of her cane meant "stop speaking" because she was counting. Evelyn learned that when his voice went flat, he had found danger. He learned never to leave an axe against a wall with the blade facing out. She learned that he checked the compass under his shirt whenever the river grew loud. On the 8th morning, he started cutting the first anchor trench. The design called for a stone housing sunk into the eastern shelf, deep enough to hold 2 iron rods and a timber deadman beneath them. Silas drove a pick into the granite seam and opened a channel while Evelyn checked the line with a weighted cord. At noon, she told him the trench had drifted west. "It hasn't," he said. "The hammer strikes are returning too quickly from the canyon wall." Silas set down the pick. "You are hearing the ice." A hard shelf of early ice had formed along the shaded wall below. It changed the echo, making the canyon seem narrower than it was. Evelyn retested from 3 positions. Each time, she reached the same conclusion. "Move the outer line 11 inches east," she said. Silas looked at the stakes. "That puts the housing off the granite seam. The seam is not where I marked it. You marked it yesterday." I was wrong yesterday. The words came clipped. She knelt, found the guide rope and began pulling the stakes herself. Silas caught her wrist before she reached the one nearest the drop. Danger. She froze. A slab of frost-loosened stone broke from the rim and vanished into the gorge. Several seconds passed before it struck below. Silas released her. Evelyn sat back on her heels. Her breathing had changed. The ice altered the echo, she said. Yes, I should have allowed for it. You have now. I put you in the wrong place. You put a trench 11 inches wrong. I've seen surveyors miss a hillside. They had eyes. The bitterness in the words did not sound as though it belonged to that morning alone. Silas crouched beside her. He did not tell her the mistake was nothing. It was not nothing. A poor anchor could kill them both. We changed the method, he said. She turned toward him. I hang 10 markers on the cliff. 3 heights. You strike the measuring rod, and I tell you which marker moves. Echo gives you distance. Movement gives me the line. You would have to climb below the rim. I already did. Alone? Before breakfast. Her mouth tightened. Silas stood. You may be the most troublesome half-worker I ever hired. I did not hire you. No, you married badly. The tension in her shoulders eased, just enough. By sunset, 3 flattened tin cups hung from cords along the cliff face. The new system worked. Evelyn struck the rod against stone. Silas watched the markers tremble and called their order. Together, they corrected the anchor line and widened the housing to account for winter expansion. The error cost them half a day. The change it forced upon them saved far more. They stopped treating sight and sound as competing measures. Silas described shape, color, distance, and movement. Evelyn tracked sequence, strain, symmetry, and time. Where one method failed, the other caught it. The eastern anchor began to take form. Then Granite Crossing closed its doors to them. Amos Klein refused the first order politely. He stood behind the general store counter with Evelyn's list spread before him. Lamp oil, nails, canvas, 2 kegs of blasting powder, and enough flour to last through December. I'd sell it if I had it, he said. You have 3 powder kegs in the back room, Evelyn replied. Amos glanced toward Silas. Silas had said nothing since entering. He stood beside the stove with the bundle of pelts he had meant to trade weeks earlier. Those kegs are spoken for. By whom? Vale Freight. All 3? Winter contracts. Evelyn folded the list. And the nails. Same. The canvas? Amos spread his hands. Darius buys in volume. I cannot anger my largest customer. You mean your largest creditor? The storekeeper's face hardened. A man keeps his business alive however he can. So does a woman. Amos lowered his voice. Mrs. Rourke, leave the bridge alone. Vale offered to buy the claim for a fair price. He offered 1/5 of what the Eastern Shelf is worth. It is worth what someone will pay. No, it is worth what it can carry. The front door opened behind them. Darius Vale stepped inside, brushing frost from his sleeves. Otis Vane followed him, smelling of whiskey despite the early hour. Vale looked at Evelyn's folded list. Building supplies? He asked. That sounds ambitious. Silas shifted away from the stove. Vale noticed. I hear you have been cutting into the Eastern Shelf, he continued. You should be careful. Granite fractures badly after the first freeze. So does a monopoly, Evelyn said. Otis laughed, then stopped when Silas looked at him. Vale moved closer to the counter. I have no quarrel with industry, Mrs. Rourke. I admire it. But a bridge across Blackglass would require territorial approval, engineering inspection, insurance, freight agreements, costs no private household can carry. We are not asking your company to carry them. You will, eventually. Evelyn turned her head toward the faint click of his watch chain. Is that why you bought every nail in town? Vale's tone remained pleasant. I bought what my wagons need. 3 kegs of blasting powder? Road work? Canvas? Winter covers? Every coil of 3/4 hemp Gideon Shaw could order from the county seat? For the first time, Vale did not answer at once. Silas watched Amos find something urgent beneath the counter. Vale smiled. You are well informed. I listen when men assume I cannot see them lie. Otis shifted against a barrel. The movement released a strong smell of coal smoke and ferry tar. Vale turned to Silas. You are a mountain man, Rourke. You know the value of choosing ground that can be held. The widow's plan will eat every dollar you own, and Springwater will take the rest. Silas said, Then you have no reason to worry. I have reason to dislike waste. Your dislike is expensive. Vale drew a small leather purse from his coat and set it on the counter. The coins inside struck one another with a heavy sound. $200, he said, for your half of the claim. The marriage may continue if that arrangement suits you. I am buying land, not sentiment. Evelyn's face did not change, but Silas saw her left hand close around the iron washer on her finger. $200 was more money than he usually saw in 2 winters. Enough for a better cabin, new traps, a pack string, and years of supplies. Vale mistook his silence for interest. You have no attachment to Granite Crossing, he said. Take the money before her bridge becomes your grave. Silas lifted the purse. Evelyn went very still. He loosened the drawstring, took out $1 silver and laid it on the counter. What is that? Vale asked. Payment for lamp oil. Amos stared at the coin. Silas pushed Evelyn's supply list toward him. Sell what Vale didn't buy. There isn't enough here to begin a bridge, Amos said. We already began. Vale's voice cooled. You are making an enemy without understanding the cost. Silas placed the purse back against Vale's chest. I understand cost. He took the bundle of pelts from beside the stove and set it on Amos's counter. These cover flour, salt, oil, and every hand-forged spike Gideon can spare. Amos ran his fingers over the top beaver skin. It is still not enough powder. We'll cut the anchor housings by hand. Evelyn turned toward him. That adds 3 weeks. Then we lose 3 weeks. We cannot lose 3 weeks. Silas looked at Vale. We won't. Vale's expression became unreadable. You believe strength will solve this, he said. No, Silas replied. That is why I married the engineer. The store went silent. Evelyn's chin lifted, not in defiance this time, but in something quieter. Vale walked out. Otis followed, his shoulder striking the doorframe in his hurry. Amos waited until their boots faded along the boardwalk. You realize he owns the ferry, the freight teams, and the road crews, he said. He can stop every shipment between here and the county line. He cannot stop trees from growing, Evelyn said. He can stop iron from arriving. Then we use less iron. Silas picked up the lamp oil and flour Amos reluctantly placed on the counter. Outside, the cold had sharpened. Wagon wheels rattled at the end of the street, where Vale's freight yard stood behind a high plank fence. Evelyn waited until they reached the wagon. You almost frightened me, she said. With the purse? With the silence. I was counting. Counting what? How many chains $200 would buy? She laughed once, surprised by the sound herself. Silas secured the supplies. "We still need those chains," he said, "and powder, and men." Evelyn rested both hands on the head of her cane. "Gideon may extend credit for ironwork. Vale will lean on him." "Yes. Anyone else?" "May Whitcomb's brother worked railroad trestles before he injured his leg. Lewis Mercer can drive a team. Neither will help while Vale holds their notes." Silas looked toward the mountains above town. Snow clouds had begun gathering around the peaks. "What can we build without them?" "The eastern anchor, the western footing, both towers, if we cut the timber now." "And after that?" "After that, we need a line across the gorge." Silas tightened the last strap. He had spent most of his life believing a man survived by needing as little as possible. Evelyn looked at the same hard world and planned something no person could finish alone. It should have struck him as weakness. Instead, it felt like the first honest measure of the work ahead. "We build what two people can," he said. "Then we make the rest of the valley decide what they're willing to live without." Evelyn reached for the wagon rail. Silas offered his forearm. This time she took it without argument. They rode out of Granite Crossing with flour, lamp oil, a sack of mismatched spikes, and no powder at all. Behind them, Darius Vale began buying the valley's fear. Ahead of them, beneath the gathering snow, 2 anchor sites waited in the granite. Snow reached the Hart claim before midnight. By dawn, 6 inches had buried the wagon tracks and softened the rim of the gorge. The river below remained black and violent, moving beneath the white country as if winter had failed to touch it. Silas cleared a path to the eastern anchor, while Evelyn worked in the stone shed. She sat with the bridge model beneath her hands and scored measurements into thin cedar strips with an awl. Each strip stood for a timber they would have to cut, shape, mark, and raise. The snow changed the order of the work, but it did not stop it. Silas felled lodgepole pines above the claim and skidded them downhill behind his mule. Evelyn marked each beam with shallow notches, 1 for the eastern tower, 2 for the western, a diagonal cut for the trusses. Silas learned the code until he could sort timber by touch inside a storm. They learned each other the same way. Silas learned that 3 taps of her cane meant stop speaking because she was counting. Evelyn learned that when his voice went flat, he had found danger. He learned never to move a tool without telling her. She learned that he touched the compass beneath his shirt whenever the river grew loud. The first help arrived 12 days later. Gideon Shaw drove up with a sled carrying iron scraps, 2 used pulley blocks, and a coil of chain patched in 3 places. "Vale know you're here?" Silas asked. "He will by supper." Evelyn stepped from the shed. "What did he offer you?" "To buy my forge note and call it due." "And what did you tell him?" "That freight horses still need shoes." Gideon handed her a folded paper bearing a county seal. "Inspection requirements. My cousin works the rail office." Vale lied. "You can build first and apply for approval after a proof load, provided the road remains open to the public." Evelyn ran her thumb over the seal. "What do I owe you?" "Write it down." She did. Gideon stayed to help raise the first tower. They assembled it on the ground, then hauled it upright with the patched chain and both horses straining in the snow. Evelyn stood beside the anchor housing with one hand on the guide rope. 2 inches north," she called. Silas shifted the base. Hold. The timber settled into stone with a groan that traveled through the earth. Evelyn smiled when the vibration reached her boots. By Christmas, both towers stood above black glass. They were rough structures, scarred by axes and strapped with mismatched iron, But they leaned against the anchors at the exact angle Evelyn had drawn. People began riding out to stare. Amos Klein delivered beans he claimed had been packed by mistake. May Whitcomb asked whether the finished bridge could carry a school wagon. Lewis Mercer offered his father's team, then withdrew the offer the next day after Vail reminded him who held the stable note. Evelyn did not condemn him. "You should be angry," Silas said. "His father has a bad heart and 3 daughters at home. He gave his word. So did the man who owns his debt." Silas drove his chisel into a mortise. "Fear makes weak timber. No, it makes men bend. Some straighten when the load changes." The rumor reached the claim 2 days after New Year's. May brought it herself. She stood inside the cabin twisting her gloves while Evelyn poured coffee. "They are saying Nathan warned you the bridge was unsound," May said. "That he died testing one of your measurements." The coffee overflowed. Silas took the pot from Evelyn before it burned her hand. "Who started it?" Evelyn asked. "Otis, at Klein's." Reverend Pike repeated it after service. Vail did not correct them. May hesitated. "People are frightened." "Leave," Silas said. Silas. But May had already taken her coat. When the door closed, Evelyn wiped the table long after the spilled coffee was gone. Silas waited. "Nathan did not die testing the bridge," she said at last. "He died on the ferry." "I know." "No, you know where they found the wreckage." She sat, folding the wet cloth into a square. "Before the quarry blast took my sight, I marked the highest flood rise on the eastern wall. Nathan said my mark was too high. He wanted to anchor a new ferry cable lower because it was cheaper. He was wrong. Yes." The word came out thin. "I told him the northern snowpack was heavy. I told him warm rain would raise the river again. He said losing my sight had made me afraid of water." Silas's jaw tightened. "He launched anyway?" "With 2 freightmen and a load of machinery. I heard the rain that morning. I heard the river under it. I begged him to wait." Her fingers closed around the iron washer on her hand. "He told me grief had made me timid. By noon, the upper cable post tore out. And Vail knows. He sold Nathan the machinery. He wrote the insurance bond." Silas moved toward the door. Evelyn stood. "Where are you going?" "To speak with him." "No. He used your husband's death." "He used what I gave him." Her voice sharpened. "I knew Nathan would go. I could have sent for Mercer. I could have cut the launch rope. Instead, I let him call me frightened and waited for the river to prove me right. You warned him. I wanted him to come home and admit I was right. That is not wanting him dead. It felt close enough when they brought me his coat." Silas stopped. He had heard killers confess with less shame. Slowly, he took Daniel's compass from beneath his shirt and placed it on the table. The brass case made a small, hard sound. "My brother could not swim," he said. Evelyn turned toward him. "We were guiding freight through the pass. The road washed out, and I found a ford upstream. I told Daniel to wait while I tested it. The men behind us complained. He hated looking weak." Silas opened the case. The damaged needle trembled without settling. "He rode in before I reached the far bank. The horse lost footing. I threw a rope. It fell short. You tried. I chose the crossing. You told him to wait. He followed my road. The river filled the quiet between them." Evelyn reached across the table. Her fingertips found the compass and then his hand. She rested 2 fingers against his knuckles, lightly enough that he could move away. He did not. "I do not know how to forgive myself," she said. "Neither do I. Then what are we doing?" Silas looked toward the window, where snow tapped the glass. Building something the river cannot carry off. Her fingers curled around his. The next morning, Evelyn altered the center truss. She added a second diagonal brace and narrowed the roadway, lowering the weight without weakening the span. Silas questioned each change. She answered until both were satisfied. They did not speak again about forgiveness. They worked. January hardened into February. Silas shaped the twin trusses on level ground behind the shed. Evelyn crawled along each frame on padded knees, testing every joint with a thin steel probe. Gideon brought bolts forged from wagon axles. May returned with 3 older students to twist hemp into a hauling line. Amos extended credit for lamp oil after Vale doubled the ferry price on his winter stock. Lewis Mercer came after dark with his father's draft team. "My father does not know," he said. Evelyn handed him a lantern. "Then we finish before he wakes." The valley had not chosen courage. Not yet. But fear had begun to cost more. By the end of February, the bridge approaches projected beyond both towers. Between them remained nearly 60 feet of open air. The center span lay complete on the eastern shelf. To place it, they would roll the frame forward on greased skids, while Lewis's horses pulled from the western side. A guide rope anchored on the east would control the swing. Silas would ride the upper cord, free any snag, and set the first pins once the span reached the opposite bearing. Evelyn walked the length of the truss with one hand on the beam. "There should be a second man on the frame," she said. "There is not enough rope to trust 2 lives. That is not an engineering answer. It is the rope we have." She stopped at the forward end. "Once the span leaves the skids, I will hear the strain through the guide line. If it begins to sing, we stop. We stop. If I call release, Lewis gives the horses slack. He knows. If I call cut, you cut the guide rope." Silas looked at her. "That rope keeps the frame from swinging into the north wall. It also runs through the eastern brace. If the span twists and overloads it, the tower may follow. Cutting it could throw me into the cliff. If the tower goes, it takes the anchor, the approach, and everyone beside it. You call cut only if the tower moves. I call before it moves." Wind hummed through the open trusses. Silas studied her across the frame. "You trust the design?" "Yes. Do you trust me on it?" Her hand tightened around the beam. "Yes." He nodded once. "Then I trust your call." For a moment, she said nothing. "That may be the most reckless thing you have done since marrying me. It has competition." They spent the final afternoon inspecting every pin, knot, pulley, and brace. Gideon checked the fittings. Lewis walked his horses along the hauling path until they obeyed his voice without jerking. May kept onlookers beyond the marked line. Deputy Mercer appeared near dusk, claiming he had come to prevent trouble. Vale watched from a closed carriage on the road. Silas climbed the eastern tower and ran his hands over the line where it passed through the upper block. No strands were broken. The fittings sat straight. The anchor rods had not shifted. Below, Evelyn rested her palm on the guide rope, memorizing its quiet vibration. Inside the cabin after dark, she removed the iron washer to wash sawdust from her hands. The skin beneath it was pale. Silas watched her slide the ring back onto her finger. "At dawn," she said, "we move the span." Silas touched Daniel's compass beneath his shirt. Outside, the 2 towers faced one another across Black Glass Gorge, joined by a single taut line, waiting to bear its first true weight. Dawn broke clear and bitter over Black Glass Gorge. Frost filmed the trusses and tightened every rope overnight. Lewis held the draft team on the western road. Gideon stood at the eastern break. May kept the onlookers behind the marked line, while Deputy Mercer watched from the cliff. Vale remained inside his carriage. Silas climbed onto the center span and tied a short safety line around his waist. The truss rested on greased skids, its forward end already hanging over empty air. Evelyn stood at the guide station. The rope lay across her palms, carrying every tremor of the bridge into her hands. "Ready?" she called. "Ready? Lewis, take the slack." The horses leaned into their collars. The span moved 6 inches. A murmur passed through the crowd. "Hold." The truss settled with a groan. Evelyn listened through the line, sorting the pull of the team from the side strain on the tower. Again, the span slid forward. At 20 feet, it left the last full skid and dropped several inches. Silas flattened himself against the upper cord as the structure swung north. "Hold!" The horses stopped. The eastern tower shuddered. "Half an inch of movement," Silas called. I felt it. "Gideon, ease the south guide." The span drifted back toward center. The tower steadied. They pulled again. A thin scraping reached Evelyn's hands, higher than the hum of loaded hemp, and wrong in its rhythm. "Hold." Everything stopped except the river. "Silas, strike the forward brace." He hit the timber with his hammer. The vibration ran through the frame and into the guide line. Again, he struck harder. "Look 3 feet above the forward knot." Silas twisted around. At first, the rope appeared whole. Then the wind turned it, revealing a pale groove across several strands. A blade mark. "Line's been cut," he shouted. Half through, someone cursed. Mercer turned toward Vale's carriage. "Bring it back," May called. "We cannot," Evelyn said. "The span is past balance. Pulling backward could roll the tower." Silas looked toward the western shelf. 30 feet of gorge remained. "Can we finish?" Before Evelyn answered, a strand parted with a sharp report. The truss jerked sideways. Lewis's horses reared. Silas's safety line dragged him against a beam, driving the breath from his chest. Evelyn wrapped the guide rope around the brake post. Another strand broke. The span rotated north, its lower cord swinging toward the cliff. Silas clawed for a brace as the world tilted beneath him. "Status," Evelyn shouted. "Still on." "Tower?" He forced himself to look east. The upper brace had begun to bow. Moving. The entire approach groaned. Snow fell from its joints. Evelyn heard the shift through her boots. The twisted line was pulling the tower sideways. If the tower failed, the eastern workers and half the approach would fall with it. She found the hatchet beside the brake post. "Silas, cut your safety line. Tie onto the inner truss." "What?" "Do it." The span dropped again. Silas slammed shoulder first into a diagonal brace. He pulled his knife, severed the rope around his waist, and looped the loose end through the truss. "Done. Move west, past the center. That puts me under the hauling block. It moves your weight away from the broken end." He crawled across the tilted frame. Black glass opened beneath him. The eastern tower shifted with a grinding crack. Evelyn had no time left. If she cut the guide line, the span would swing into the north wall. The impact would destroy the forward truss and might kill Silas. If she did not, the tower would go. "Silas." He stopped halfway across. "I am cutting the guide." The north wall waited 20 feet away, jagged with granite shelves. "How long?" 3 breaths. He looked toward the eastern rim. Evelyn stood with the hatchet raised, her face turned toward him. He had promised to trust her call. Silas hooked one arm through the truss. "Do it." Evelyn drew one breath. Two. On the third, she swung. The rope split. The span leaped sideways. Silas released his grip an instant before the truss struck the canyon wall. Timber burst around him. The shock threw him against the upper cord, and the hauling block tore free overhead. For one terrible second, he hung with nothing beneath his left boot. Then the broken span settled on a narrow granite shelf. The remaining hauling line held. Across the gorge, the eastern tower creaked but stayed upright. "Silas?" Evelyn called. He tried to answer. Pain closed around his ribs. "Silas." "Here." Gideon and Lewis secured the line. Mercer organized a second rope. Nearly an hour passed before they brought Silas back across the damaged frame. Evelyn waited until his boots reached solid ground. Then her hands found his coat, shoulders, and face. "Tell me where." "Shoulder. Ribs. Can you breathe?" "Enough." Her fingers touched the scrape at his temple and began to shake. "You obeyed me. You were right." "I was not certain." Silas caught her wrist. "You did not need certainty. You needed the better choice." Behind them, another joint cracked. Months of labor sagged uselessly against the cliff. Vale stepped from his carriage at last. "A tragedy narrowly avoided," he said. Mercer faced him. "The guideline was cut before the pull. Then investigate whoever had access." Otis stood behind the carriage. A fresh nick marked the skinning knife on his belt. Gideon saw it. So did Silas. Mercer followed their gaze, but Otis closed his coat and backed toward the road. Evelyn heard Vale approach. "I warned you," he said. "End this before someone dies." For the first time since the courthouse, she had no answer. That night, Silas lay in the cabin with his ribs bound. Evelyn sat at the table, removing the center braces from the bridge model one by one. "I am closing the claim," she said. "No. The span is gone. We have no money for new rope or iron." "That is tomorrow's problem. Nathan died after I kept searching for another solution. This is not Nathan. No, it is you." Her voice broke. "I heard the line failing and ordered you into a cliff. You saved me. This time." Silas pushed himself upright and crossed the room. He placed a short length of hemp on the table. Evelyn found the severed strands, then the clean diagonal cut several inches from the break. "That was done with a knife," he said. A knock sounded. Gideon entered carrying the damaged pulley fitting. "The retaining pin has 2 file marks," he said. "Same spacing as the rasp I repaired for Otis last month. Mercer has gone to find him." Evelyn traced the cut again. Certainty began to replace guilt. Not erase it, but give it direction. "Vale will say Otis acted alone." "Probably," Silas said. "And if we rebuild with hemp, they cut it again." "We do not rebuild with hemp." "With what money?" Silas reached beneath his shirt. The compass chain whispered against his coat. For a moment his hand closed around the brass case. Then he drew it over his head and set it beside the rope. Evelyn recognized it by touch. "No. The mule. My pelts. And this will buy chain from the railroad yard." "Daniel's compass is not bridge iron. It has pointed me back to the same river for 6 years. It points you to your brother." Silas closed the case over the damaged needle. "My brother is gone. You are here." He pressed the compass into her palm. "Sell it." Evelyn curled her fingers around the brass. "You may regret that." "Maybe. And if the bridge fails again?" Then we learn why. She stood silent for a long moment. Outside, lanterns moved toward the road as men searched for Otis. The broken bridge waited in the dark, and by morning, Vale would make certain the valley knew it had failed. Then Evelyn returned the center section to the model. "Not rope," she said. "Chain. Twin guidelines and separate anchors. If one side is damaged, the second carries the turn." Gideon nodded. "More iron than Vale can buy out from under us. Not if we reach the railroad yard first." Silas felt hope return, hard and practical. Evelyn faced him. "We begin again at daylight." This time, no one laughed. The people outside had heard her through the open door. One by one, they began offering what they had. By sunrise, the Hart claim had become a work camp. Men who had watched from the road now carried timber. May kept a ledger. Amos sent coffee without pretending it was a mistake. Lewis brought both teams in daylight, and his father came behind him with a hammer. Gideon returned from the railroad yard 3 days later with chain blackened by coal smoke. The price had taken Silas's mule, his winter pelts, and the brass compass. He said nothing when the crate was opened. Evelyn ran both hands along the links. "Twin lines," she said. "Separate anchors. No single cut can take the span." They rebuilt under her direction. Silas worked with his ribs strapped and his left arm slow. When he tried to lift more than he should, Evelyn heard the hitch in his breathing and reassigned him before pride became injury. By the second week of March, a new center span rested across Black Glass Gorge. No cheer went up when the last pin entered. The workers simply stood on either side of the roadway, looking at what their hands had made. Then warm rain began falling on the mountain snow. The river rose through the night. On the morning set for the proof load, Darius Vale arrived with Deputy Mercer and a folded order bearing the county seal. "This structure is closed pending inspection," Vale said. "No wagon crosses." "The proof load is the inspection," Evelyn replied. "Not without an authorized surveyor." A horn sounded from downstream, long and ragged. Lewis climbed the tower ladder. "The lower landing is gone." The river had torn the ferry cable loose. On the far side, May's school wagon stood trapped on the low road. Brown water covered the route behind it and climbed around the wheels. 6 children crowded inside. Vale caught Mercer's sleeve. "The bridge is under closure." Mercer pulled free. Gideon came from the shed carrying the damaged fitting, and Otis's knife wrapped in cloth. Otis signed a statement, said Vale paid him to weaken the pull. Vale's face emptied. "A drunkard's lie. The circuit judge can decide," Mercer said. Another section of the far road collapsed into the river. Silas was already saddling Lewis's strongest horse. Evelyn gripped the nearest chain. The bridge answered the river wind with a deep trembling note. Beneath it, one faster vibration struck her palm out of rhythm. "Wait." Silas stopped at the entrance. She moved to the north anchor and pressed both hands against the housing. The left chain carried more strain. Warm rain had softened the fill beneath the eastern approach, lowering one side. "How bad?" Silas asked. "Enough to twist under a wagon." She faced the workers. "Move the stacked stone to the south brace. Lewis, bring the empty freight sled onto the north approach and lock the wheels." Vale stepped into the roadway. "You cannot risk those children on an unapproved bridge. You risked them when you made one ferry the valley's only road." He did not move. Silas took Vale by the arm and set him outside the tower. "Work," Silas said. Men shifted stone. Lewis chained the freight sled in place. Evelyn kept one hand on the anchor while the unequal beat slowed into rhythm. "Now." Silas led the horse onto the bridge. The first hoof struck the planks with a hollow report. The roadway flexed beneath him, not loosely, but like a thing taking weight. Halfway across, a gust swept through the gorge. The chains groaned. "Keep moving!" Evelyn called. He did. On the far side, water had reached the wagon bed. May was lifting out the smallest child. "The rear wheel is sunk," she shouted. "Leave the wagon." They tied the children in pairs with harness straps. Silas placed two on the horse and carried a boy whose leg had been pinned beneath a bench. May took the youngest girl. The others gripped the safety rope. The ferry house broke apart downstream as they stepped onto the bridge. Boards and barrels spun into the gorge. One heavy timber struck the western approach. The bridge jolted. At the eastern anchor, Evelyn felt the north chain leap. "Stop!" Silas froze near the center with the injured boy against his chest. The counterweight sled had shifted through the mud. "More stone to the south brace," Evelyn ordered. "Not the anchor, the brace." Reverend Pike and Amos joined the line, passing rocks hand to hand. Mercer removed his badge, shoved it into his pocket, and lifted the first stone himself. The irregular vibration eased. "Come ahead," Evelyn said. Silas moved one step at a time. The children reached the eastern shelf first. May followed, soaked to the waist. Silas came last, carrying the injured boy, as the river took the remains of Vale's landing below them. When his boots left the bridge, the crowd broke into the raw sound of parents finding their children alive. Evelyn found Silas by his voice. "The north line?" he asked. "Held. The span?" "Held." He put her hand against the boy's breathing chest. So did he. Mercer arrested Vale before noon. Otis's statement led to altered freight records, forged signatures, and the false bond used against the Hart claim. The closure order was withdrawn, and the county surveyor certified the bridge 2 days later after loaded wagons crossed safely in both directions. Spring changed Granite Crossing. Freight no longer traveled 3 days south to the ferry. Farmers carried seed across Blackglass. The doctor crossed without charge. May's school wagon crossed each morning, and every child fell silent at the middle. Evelyn set a fair toll for commercial loads and none for emergencies, students or families on foot. She hired widows to keep accounts, and men with damaged limbs to inspect pins and collect fees. Silas maintained the towers and approaches. Whenever a traveler called it Rourke's Bridge, he pointed toward Evelyn's office beside the eastern anchor. Ask the engineer. In June, the first railroad contract paid in gold. That evening, Evelyn asked Silas to meet her at the center of the bridge. Sunset warmed the boards, and the chains carried the fading tremor of wheels into her hand. She held out a cloth bundle. Silas opened it. Daniel's compass lay inside. The brass had been polished, though the needle still wandered. Inside the lid, a single word had been engraved. Home. "I thought Gideon sold it," he said. "He did. I bought it back." "You paid too much." "Yes." "Bad business. Terrible." Silas closed the compass. Evelyn removed the iron washer from her finger and placed it in his palm. "Our agreement ends in October," she said. "You may sign back your half of the claim." The bridge hummed beneath them. Silas looked toward the high ridges where he had once expected to spend every winter alone. "Is that what you want?" "No." The answer came without hesitation. "I proposed a marriage because I needed standing in court," she said. "I am asking for another because I want the man who trusted me when he could not see where he would land." Silas slipped the iron ring back onto her finger. "This one still has rough edges." So do we." He kissed her with the certainty of someone who had stopped mistaking motion for freedom. A wagon entered the western approach. Evelyn rested one hand on the railing and felt its weight travel toward them through timber, chain, and stone. Silas placed the compass beneath his shirt. This time, it did not point him back to the river. It reminded him where he had chosen to remain. They stood together while the wagon passed and the bridge carried its burden safely into the valley.